Hello, everyone. My name is Steve Johnson. I'm the AWS Tech Lead for mobile, and today we're going to talk about application development with AWS Amplify and the AWS Cloud Development Kit. Now, if you've been following AWS mobile and web development, you're probably a little familiar with Amplify. You're probably familiar with the Amplify CLI, but we've had a lot of customers start asking us about using the CDK because they really like the CDK for doing infrastructure as code, and they want to see if they can integrate that with the Amplify client libraries. So that's what we're going to talk about today, and let's get started. Just some quick review. If you're not terribly familiar with front-end development in AWS, we have AWS Amplify, which is actually several different products. We have client-side libraries. We have a tool chain called the CLI, and we have a console for deploying and building web applications. All of those work together, or you can use them independently of each other. For the API layer, which is a popular way to build mobile and web applications now, just about every mobile and web app we see has an API layer of some kind. And our reference architecture includes something called AWS AppSync, which is our managed GraphQL service. If you've used REST APIs in the past, you can think of AppSync as analogous in function. But there are a lot of advantages to GraphQL. We're not going to talk a lot about that today, if at all, but we have lots of other resources in online tech talks and other content available on the site. And the third item in our front-end development collection is AWS Device Farm. Now, if you're not familiar with Device Farm, it is exactly what it sounds like. We have real mobile devices set up and hooked up to the AWS cloud, so you can load your applications on real devices, test them remotely, take screenshots, and basically automate your CI/CD pipeline for mobile and web in the cloud. So let's look a little closer at Amplify, because we'll be talking about that today. You might have seen this slide before. This has the three parts of Amplify I just mentioned. We have client-side libraries, we have the CLI, our tool chain, and then the console. So as you can see from the slide, the libraries and the CLI were originally designed to work close together. So the resources that are created by the Amplify CLI are configured in such a way that the libraries know how to talk to them right off the bat. So if you're not familiar with the development experience for the CLI, not surprisingly, it's a command line tool. And you tell the CLI what types of resources you want in your application. And these are called categories. So you can have categories like authentication, right, which is backed by Cognito, storage, which is backed by either DynamoDB or S3, depending on the type of storage you want. We have an API category, which supports both REST and GraphQL API types. And the nice thing about this is the CLI will just give you a series of questions that you can answer on your terminal. You don't have to know a lot about AWS. You don't have to make a lot of tough decisions. Everything that the CLI builds is done using best practices. It's secure, it's scalable, and it works. And the CLI also does one other thing, which is create a configuration file that the libraries use so they know how to interact with these resources you made. Now, the console service, as I mentioned before, is for web applications. And one of the things we're going to do today is actually build an Amplify React application. We're going to deploy it to the console, and then we're going to add resources using CDK and use the Amplify client-side libraries to add some features to our app. Should also mention that Amplify supports a wide variety of platforms. Not surprisingly, we support things like Android and iOS. We have a lot of JavaScript-based platforms that are supported, including things like React, Angular, and Vue. We also support cross-platform environments like React Native and Flutter, which is currently in open beta right now. You have access to it. We're probably going to have that in GA very soon. It's something that was requested by our customers, so we're really excited about that as well. So once again, let's talk about the CLI, because it's probably what you might be used to. The Amplify CLI begins with a call to init, which sets up some configuration and some directories inside your project, whether that project is a React web page, whether it's an Android project or iOS, what have you. And then it's just a matter of telling Amplify to add certain categories. And for today, we're just going to be working with auth, because it's probably the most popular category that's added to Amplify applications for obvious reasons. You know, it gives you a way to log in. It gives you a way to federate users if you desire to do that. So we'll be handling auth today using the CDK. And once you're finished configuring your application, you just call Amplify push. It generates a CloudFormation template and deploys that template to AWS. So if the CLI is really useful and our customers love it, which they do, why do we need to integrate with CDK? The main reason is that the CLI is very opinionated, and it presents configuration options as questions, right? So as you work with the CLI, it'll ask you a series of questions about your use case, and based on your answers to those questions, it'll configure your backend and create the CloudFormation template. Some customers have told us that they like the concept of the CLI, and it works great, but they need more control over their resources. They need fine-grained configuration for things like naming and tagging, detailed configuration items that may not be supported by the CLI yet, and easier integration with existing CI/CD pipelines. One of the great things about the CDK is that it is infrastructure as code. So it's not just a question of, you know, creating CloudFormation templates, right? You're actually writing code in the language of your choice. Things like TypeScript and Python are supported. So you can create and manage your backend configuration as code. So you can check that in with the rest of your project and deploy it just using command line tools, which of course can be triggered by your CI/CD pipeline events. So just to show you some pictures, some diagrams of what we were just talking about. You know, the end game of what we want to do is use the Amplify client libraries, because we have found customers really love them. It abstracts away a lot of the boilerplate and best practice code that gets duplicated across clients, and just makes it really a streamlined experience to add features to your applications. And you know, as we go through the demo in a minute, you'll see just how easy that is. Of course, we want these libraries to talk to our stack on the back end. And I'm saying it's a CloudFormation stack because that's the way we recommend deploying resources to the cloud, just because they're easier to manage. And in order for these libraries to talk to the back end, there's a configuration file. In our case, since it's React, there's a file that is generated called AWS exports, and that is generated by the Amplify CLI. So after you finish answering the questions, it generates the backend resources for you and gives you a configuration file that is used in your web application or your mobile application So all of those resources are automatically configured. When we talk about using Amplify libraries with the CDK, it's basically the same concept, right? You have the CDK, which allows you to define infrastructure as code. It will generate and deploy CloudFormation templates for you, and you can use the output of the CDK deployment to populate your AWS exports file. So that's what we're going to show today. I'm not going to be using the CLI, but I will be doing everything just using the CDK. So what are we going to see today? I'm going to start a demo in a couple minutes, and we're going to use the CDK to build a code repository and code commit and create an Amplify project on the Amplify console. Now, these are not technically part of your application, but it's a good demo to show how CDK can be used to build infrastructure, including infrastructure that's not directly part of your application. Next, we're going to configure some resources used by Amplify Client Libraries. In this case, we're adding authentication, which is going to be a login screen and a sign out button in the application itself. And that's going to be supported by Cognito. And lastly, we're going to deploy that app to the console itself. Okay, so as I mentioned before, we're going to be using the auth category, primarily because it's the most popular category for Amplify applications. And there are actually several elements and a lot of features and a lot of options to configure. So it's not a trivial example, right? What we're going to build using the CDK template today is a Cognito user pool. That user pool will have an app client, right? And if you're not familiar with Cognito, Cognito user pools is an identity provider. So it keeps track of your users, passwords, groups, permissions, those types of things. And an app client represents a type of access to that pool or an application that will access that pool, because Cognito user pools can be used across different applications. So we're going to define one app client for that user pool, and we're going to tie that user pool to something called a Cognito federated identity pool. Now, if you're familiar with Cognito, you know that a federated identity pool is something that exchanges AWS credentials for other types of credentials from other identity providers, right? Just like you can exchange a Cognito user pool token for AWS credentials using the federated identity pool, you can get credentials from Google, Twitter, Amazon, SAML, OIDC sources, right? And you can get AWS credentials for them. So each pool is going to have what we call default authenticated and unauthenticated roles. In our case, we're not going to allow unauthenticated access, so we just have one default authenticated role. And that role, of course, is attached to an IAM policy, which gives you your permissions. Okay. So I'm going to shut down the presentation right now and switch over to the Cloud9 console, where we are going to do the first part of the demo, which is building a backend with the CDK. So here we are in Cloud9. I've created an environment, and I'm using the Cloud9 IDE to demonstrate the project today. So I've already created a React application called CDK Amplify, and I'm going to open up a terminal in the IDE really quickly. And as I go down into the project directory, you can see this is a standard React project. And if I start it up using npm start, you will see there is the standard vanilla hello world React application. So since we're focusing today on CDK and Amplify, I'm not going to be spending a lot of time writing React code. Our objective for today is basically put a login screen on this application, so you have to create a user and log in before you use it, and put a sign out button on the application so you can sign out again. So now that you know what that looks like, we need to go into our project, and we will create a directory for our first CDK project. We're breaking it out into 2 CDK projects. The first one, called CDK Backend, is the project that will build our code commit repository and add a project to the Amplify console. So we start by adding a directory, which we're going to call CDK Backend. Change to that, and we are going to initialize our project using the CDK CLI. So we do CDK init, and for today we're going to be using TypeScript. Okay, so CDK is setting up a project directory for us, and it will give us a blank template that we can use to start writing our CDK code. All right, it's all done. Go up to CDK backend here. You can see it's populated this directory for me. And if I go down to lib, the lib directory, you'll see there's a CDK backend TypeScript file. Just a couple things I want to show you here. Basically the stack that will be generated is a TypeScript class that extends one of the core objects in the CDK library called a stack, not surprisingly. And the class name itself is generated based off of the directory that I created. So I created something called CDK-backend. So that becomes camel case CDK backend stack. And as I mentioned before, we are going to write some code that builds a code commit repository and an Amplify console project. So since I hate typing a lot, I'm going to paste this in and then explain what I did. Okay. As you can see, this is only, with comments and white space included, this is only 30 lines of code, but just this small amount of code is going to generate the resources we need. So let's take a look at this really closely. We have, we're importing classes from the CDK core, and then each service supported by the CDK is going to have its own library, right? So since I'm creating code commit, there's a code commit library, we have an Amplify library. I should also mention the Amplify that's used in this example is the Amplify console, not the Amplify development environment. And I'll show you the difference between those libraries, when we start working on the client side. So we have a constructor for our class, and the way we create resources in CDK is by creating new objects. And the interesting thing about it is by creating these objects, CDK knows automatically how to write the CloudFormation template and deploy it. Now we could use new by itself, but if we want to name those resources and reference them in other CDK expressions, we can do that too. So a common pattern is going to be const, name of resource equals new CDK object. So we're creating a code commit repository here. We give it a name. This is going to be then the name that actually shows up on the console, and a description. Okay. And the second part of the CDK script here is going to be creating a new Amplify app, which we're calling CDK Amplify-app. We want to use the code commit source code provider, and that's because the console allows you to link in source code from a bunch of different services, including GitHub, right, and GitLab. But in our case, we're going to be using AWS Code Commit. And then it tells which repository to look for when it's time to build our application, right? So as you can see here, we're just referencing Amplify React sample repo up here. And we'll add a branch to our application, right? So if anything changes on the master branch, that's when the console is going to know to rebuild. Okay, so we have our source code here, and we should be ready to actually deploy it. So I'm already in CDK backend here. This is our CDK project. And the first thing I want to do is a build, right? So npm run build inside a CDK project will build the JavaScript and get us ready to deploy. So I'll do a npm run build. Okay, and if you noticed over here in the file tree, it actually generated a couple files here under lib and some more under bin. So now we're ready to do a deployment, which we can do by typing CDK deploy. Now, while this is moving along, I sort of preloaded libraries, so you didn't have to watch me do like npm install on the different packages. But just keep in mind, as you add libraries to your code, just like any other code, you need to install the associated libraries. Okay. So it's completed the deployment now, and let's see what we have on the management console. Let's go to code commit first. Okay, there's our Amplify React test repo. Not surprisingly, it's empty. We haven't put any code in there yet, but it exists, which is our first victory of the day. So the next thing we're going to take a look at is the Amplify console and see if it created our application. Okay, so we have a sample React app. So we have, a master branch. Continuous deploys are set up on this. That's a default setting. And the nice thing about CDK is you don't necessarily have to configure every single piece of the resource, right? In a lot of cases, when you use the higher order components in CDK, they will make common sense, best practice assumptions for you in the configuration of your products, right? So now that I have a project in the Amplify console, I need to get my source in there. So let's go back to Cloud 9. And I'm currently in the CDK, but I want to go back up to the React project directory, right? So that's a local Git environment called master. I haven't linked this project up to the repository yet. So let's go ahead and do that. So I'm going to go back to code commit. And I am going to get the Git URL of my repository so I can link my local environment to that, which is down here. Just going to grab that. Okay, so I'm in the project directory for my React app, and I am going to link this local Git directory with our code commit repository. So I'm going to start with Git remote add origin, and then paste in the Git URL. And now I'm going to add everything in the project directory and the subdirectories to my commit space, and then commit those changes. Okay. So now it's time to push. So I do git push, set upstream origin on the master branch. So this will associate the master branch locally with the master branch in my repository. Okay, back to code commit. Let's see what's going on. Let's do a refresh. And sure enough, there's our code, which is great. Let's go over to the Amplify console and see what's going on over there. Okay, as you can see, because we actually did a commit or a push onto the main branch, the build has already started. So we've provisioned some hardware inside Amplify console, and it's currently building the application. And every time we push code to the master branch, it'll rebuild the application for us. And this is a self-contained deployment environment. You don't have to set anything up. Basically, you do what we just did, right, to make this work. You have a code repository, you associate a branch of that repository with an application, and every time you push, it'll do a build and deployment for you. Okay, so we've finished the first part of the demonstration here. We've set up our back end, and the next thing we want to do is add some resources so we can have an authentication feature on our simple React application. So I'm going to go back. Whoops, I'm already there. I'm already at the React application. I'm going to make another directory called CDK auth, which is going to hold our authentication resources. So let's go down to there, and we're going to initiate another CDK project. So as you can see, we're doing the same process we used before. I just happen to be putting these directories underneath the React directory because I want all of this saved in source control. Obviously, you can use whatever source control scheme pleases you. But for my purposes, I just like having it all under the project. Okay, so now we have our CDK project up here. Let's go to CDK auth. Inside lib, there's our template. It's called CDK auth stack. And just like before, I'm going to paste in the code for this, and then we can take a look at it. Okay, so let's get rid of this real quick. Okay, so we're going to need to add the Cognito module, so let's do that. Okay, I used a specific version of the CDK. It's basically good practice to keep all versions of CDK libraries consistent with each other. If you leave off the version, obviously it'll just grab the latest stable one. But since I created and tested this demo with 1.66, that's what I'm going to use. Okay, so let's go back to our auth stack. Okay, and it gets rid of the error, which is great. And let's take a look at what we're actually building here. So inside the CDK libraries, there is different levels of objects you can work with. The first level is called level 1, very creatively named, which is basically the auto-generated libraries that are created from the CloudFormation APIs, right? So anytime you have a CDK object that begins with CFN here, you are using sort of like the base level CloudFormation level, lowest level objects, right? And they have access to all of the configuration options in CloudFormation, which makes them very useful. You'll see up here, there's actually another type of object without the CFN. This is called a level 2 object. Now, these are curated objects that are actually built by the CDK team that give you a higher layer of abstraction, potentially a more useful syntax. Like I mentioned before, these higher level objects will make assumptions for you based on best practices and common use cases, things like that. So we're actually using both here, right? So I start off by creating a user pool using the level 2 object, the curated user pool object. And it allows me to configure a couple different elements here in the user pool. First, we're going to verify the email when a new user signs up. And of course, if we're going to do that, we also have to allow Cognito to have users register for new accounts. That's what the self-sign-up enabled true is for. Now, there's still some other things we want to do with the user pool, like set a password policy. And since we can't set a password policy using the L2 object yet, we're going to use the level 1 object. And it's fairly straightforward here, right? We're going to create the CFN user pool object with a password policy. And we're making it a node of the L2 object. That's what this pattern is, right? So we create a user pool, we create a separate object, but make it a child of the L2 object. So all of this configuration will be reflected in a single user pool. Okay, so we have our user pool, and now it's time for a user pool client. The user pool client tells Cognito what type of client is attaching to the user pool, like what class of application or which application is connecting to the user pool. So in our case, we're only going to have one of these, and it's going to be a client web application client, and it's fairly simple, right? We create the user pool client, we attach it to the user pool, and we're basically done. We're just using the defaults here. If you remember our diagram before, we also have an identity pool with an authenticated role and the associated permissions. So once again, we're using the lower level object here for the identity pool. We're saying we're not going to allow unauthenticated identities, and we're going to associate it with the user pool we just created, right? Okay, and the rest of this is just defining the role. We have an IAM role that is defined as the default authenticated role. It's going to put in some conditions here, like that says who can authenticate, with this identity pool and who's entitled to have AWS permissions. You can read up on this in the Cognito documentation if you're curious. And lastly, we add a policy to the role that lets you add events to the mobile analytics service, as well as access parts of Cognito sync and identity. Okay, so the nice part about this, at least I feel, this is a lot more straightforward than using CloudFormation templates. It's a lot easier to read. It reads like code because it is code. And once you take out the white space and other things, we're still talking about a fairly short piece of code here, right under 65 lines of code. What I'm doing down here are CloudFormation outputs. Okay, so if you've worked with CloudFormation templates before, you know You can tell the template to actually output certain values. This is really useful for if you want easy access to like ARNs and other properties of the resources that you've built. And this is going to become extremely important when we build our AWS exports file. Remember I said before, if we had been using the Amplify CLI, that would generate AWS exports for us. In our case, since we're not using the CLI, we need to construct that file ourselves. And that's what all of these outputs will do when we deploy the stack. Okay, so enough talk. Let's deploy some stuff. I'm in CD auth right now. I'm going to do an npm run build. To compile our CDK code. All right, and then a CDK deploy. One thing I like about the CDK deployment is they actually warn you about things like IAM statement changes, like if you're making changes to the security of your application. It sort of warns you about that just in case you hadn't intended it. But it's a nice it's a nice check before you go ahead and modify your stack. So you'll see here where CDK is deploying all of the pieces we were interested in. There's 8 resources total, which include things like the user pool, the identity pool, the role, the client, the policy. And it comes together pretty well. So while that's happening, let's go back to the Amplify console. You can see our original deployment is finished, probably finished a while ago because it wasn't not a very complicated app. But from here in the console, we can take a look at the application as deployed. So we can put restrictions around this. We can password protect this, for example, if you just want to do some testing from the console. But this is actually deployed outside of my little Cloud9 environment here. It's actually deployed via console, so that's pretty neat. Okay, we have now completed the deployment of our user pool and identity pool and all the things we need to make the Amplify Auth client work. Okay, so now that we have our backend for authentication, let's head back to our app and modify it so we can log in and log out. So do that from the command line, back up to the app directory. Into source, and let's take a look at app.js. So this is the default Hello World React application that we've been working with so far. It is not an Amplify application because we have not initialized the project as an Amplify application, nor have we imported any Amplify libraries. So let's take care of that as fast as we can. If you haven't used auth before in React, there's a couple things we have to do. And as mentioned before, the first thing we really want to do is create that properties file called AWS exports. So I'm going to go into source here, create a new file. Oops, excuse me. I'm going to call it AWS exports.js. And I am going to add all of the code required in this file to define our authentication environment. So let's go there. Oops. Okay, so the way AWS exports works is it exports a JavaScript object that contains all the properties we need. So let's go over to CloudFormation and take a look at the deployment we just made. Okay, that was our auth stack. And if we go to outputs, remember we had the output code there, I can easily pull up the references we need to populate the file. So this is our identity pool ID. I apologize for the back and forth. If you want, you could certainly script something that would do this automatically for you. I apologize for having to go back and forth here, but we have the identity pool ID, we have the user pool ID, and then we need a web client ID, which is our guy over here. Okay, and the regions are just US East 1 for us right now. So let's put those in. Okay, so now we have a populated AWS exports that are tied to the resources we created with CDK. Now we should be ready to write some code. And we're going to start with the Amplify libraries we're going to use for authentication. So let's do that. And you can see, excuse me. You can see we're importing an Amplify object, which is the parent object that holds the configuration for all the different Amplify categories, right? Pulled from the Amplify library. And then we're picking two specific UI elements from our Amplify UI library for React, right? So one of the nice things about Amplify, aside from the JavaScript libraries, we have the core JavaScript libraries that can be used in any JavaScript environment, just about. But we also have higher order components that are specific to platforms. So the AWS Amplify UI React library, not surprisingly, contains React UI elements or React functions, which I'll show you. So Amplify sign out, right, is a banner that we can put on our application here. It's a React component. So I just have to put Amplify sign out, short tag it, and when it renders the div here, that sign out banner will be at the top. Probably one of the most impressive things in the auth library is something called with authenticator. This is a function that wraps a component, and access to that component will now be guarded by a Cognito login, right? So if you think about that, we've added literally 2 lines of code, not including the imports, to our application, and now it is, a secure application. Now, it's a trivial application that's secure, but the security itself is not trivial, right? This is guarded by AWS Cognito. You have full control over the configuration of that, how people sign up, the types of passwords and verification, MFA, all that good stuff. So now that we have that in place, it will compile, but it will not run because there's one more thing we have to do, and that is to import our configuration from the file and configure Amplify, which we do right here, right? So we import that JavaScript object from AWS exports, pass it to configure, and the configuration is done. Okay. So now let's head back over to the script here. And let's run the application. So it's taking a little longer because it's compiling the Amplify libraries. Let's do a preview of that and see what it looks like. Oops. Okay, so because we did the with authenticator function, it is now guarding the application using the Cognito login. And this is a brand new user pool, so we don't have a user in here yet. So I'm just going to grab a temporary email address here so I can verify my identity. I'm going to copy that and send it over when I create an account, because it's going to ask for my email address. So now I have an email. Let's use my name, password that obeys the rules, and phone number. So now Cognito sent me a confirmation code to my email. So I'm going to hop over to my inbox again. There's my code. Hop over to React and confirm. So now that I've confirmed my account, it knows I'm authenticated, signs me in, and shows me the application. And here's our sign out banner. If I click on that, I'm back to the login page again. So there's only one thing left to do, and that is deploy our new updated application, our Amplify application, to the console. So if we go back here, I'm just going to shut down the local server. Okay, so let's update our code commit repository with the changes we made. And let's do a commit. Okay. And now we're going to push our changes. So now we've pushed our changes to our code commit repository. Let's take a look at that. See what's going on. You can see we now have the Amplify in our code. That's great. And let's go back to Amplify console. And as you can see, we've now pushed our changes. They're in the repository and the build is executing. Okay, well, that concludes the demo part of this. I tried to go through in as much detail as probably you'd need if you haven't done this before. The actual process is a lot more streamlined and easy to use once you've done it, probably once or twice. The main things I want you to take away from the demo today is, first of all, you can use the Amplify Client Libraries very easily by themselves. We do have documentation on the different categories that tell you how to use those libraries with existing resources. Today's demo was just to show you, okay, use the Amplify Client Libraries with CDK generated backends. And because it is infrastructure as code, because you can, keep your entire configuration front to back, full stack, in source control, and treat everything like code. It's a very, very elegant and streamlined environment for doing cloud development. So I'm excited about it. I know the Amplify folks are excited about it. Even the CDK folks are excited about it. You know, all these really cool things are starting to come together, and I guarantee in the next year or so, we're going to continue to build new features and new products that make this even easier. So thank you very much for your attention. It's been a pleasure talking with everybody. Thanks for showing up. If you've made it this far to the end, thank you. You're awesome. And also, please make sure you leave some feedback. So if there's anything that was particularly annoying or fantastic, we can fix it next time. So thanks again, and I'll see you next time. Bye-bye.